And then she would get herself to school early.
All right, good evening, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting titled Umbrellas and Angels, I think is what I'm going to call it. So, or Umbrella and Angel, I'm not sure. Anyway, we'll see. Right now I'm just going to set the stage. It's just going to be a very simple coat of light, bright blue, consisting of cerulean, a touch of rose red, a little white, and I'm going to gesso the canvas with some mineral spirits, so that'll just kind of start this one off.
Just refusing help from others. And I can do this myself, and I need to do it myself. In writing this book, when the body says no, and this is the Canadian version of it, it's not what the American version looks like, but it's the same text. I interviewed a lot of people with different illnesses, I reviewed my own cases, and I looked at the medical literature. So it turns out there was a study done at Yale University Medical School on people with ALS. And here's what they found. They said, hard, steady work, sorry, let me just find this quote here. Yeah. These patients invariably evoked admiration and respect from all staff who came into contact with them. Characteristic was their attempt to avoid asking for help. Hard, steady work without recourse to help from others was pervasive. They seemed to have been a habitual denial, suppression of fear, anxiety, sadness. Most expressed the necessity to be cheerful, and so on. In other words, exactly what I found in my experience with ALS patients. And then what I also did is I looked at the biography of famous people who I knew had certain diseases. So I looked up Gilda Radner, the comedian, and her ovarian cancer. Looked up her biography. Looked up the biography of Betty Ford and her breast cancer. Looked at the biography of Lou Gehrig and his Lou Gehrig's disease, which is ALS. Lou Gehrig, for the younger of you, being a famous baseball player who was a star with the New York Yankees in the 1930s and I think early 40s, whose record for a number of hits was only broken a couple of years ago by Derek Jeter of the Yankees. And who set another very famous record, though. Does anyone remember what that was? Consecutive games played. He never missed a game. And it turns out it's not that he was never injured. At one point his hands were x-rayed, and it turns out that his fingers had been fractured 17 different times. And his teammates described him as grimacing like a maddened monkey in agony as he fielded the ball, but he still never missed a game. Or he had a flu, and he was still playing. And on the other hand, when a young teammate of his, a rookie, got sick with the flu and was unable to play, and the manager was very upset with the kid, Gehrig said, "What are you talking about? He's got a flu, he can't play." And Gehrig took the kid to his own home, where he lived with his mom. His mom put the rookie into Gehrig's own bed. Lou slept on the living room couch, while his mother nursed his kid back to health, but he never missed a game until he could no longer drag himself around the baseball diamond, and they said he was the nicest guy in the world. And I'm saying that that's why the illness. When there's a rigidity in our emotional responses, and a rigidity that we impose on ourselves, that results in rigidity of our nervous system, because you can't separate the mind from the body. And I'll talk to you about that in more detail. The question now is, if I develop this perspective, am I blaming the patient? And there was a very famous essay by Susan Sontag, Cancer as Metaphor, when she had breast cancer. I think it was breast cancer, or cancer anyway. And she just absolutely militantly, and even with some degree of hostility, rejected the idea that there's anything about the patient's life that accounts for the disease. And she thought I was blaming the patient. And this blaming the patient is what's brought out as the counter to the case that I'm making here today. Well, the fact is we're not blaming anybody, because what happens when we look at the lives of these people? So the school teacher I told you about, when I got her life history, began with an adoption. She was an adopted child. And shortly after she was adopted, the adoptive mother gets pregnant, which, by the way, is not unusual. And it tells us something about infertility and stress. When you're really striving for something and you're totally attached to it, and then you let go, guess what? It happens. Not the first time in life that we learned that lesson. Right? Anyway, the adoptive mother gets pregnant. You can imagine what the story is from there. The story is that the adopted child never feels that she's as welcome to exist as the biological child. So she compensates by suppressing her needs and by making herself no trouble at all for the parents. Now they will perhaps accept her. The problem is that those early coping patterns then become our personalities. And what we think of the personality, and we think we are the personality, we're not the personality. The personality is who we're not, actually, very often. And let me read you a quote here from an article from the journal Pediatrics, which is the official journal of the American Pediatric Association. This came out 2 years ago. Now, they're not talking about what I'm talking about, because I don't think they had that vision exactly, but they are talking about what I'm talking about, except maybe they don't know it. But here's what they say. Growing scientific evidence demonstrates that social and physical environments that threaten human development because of scarcity or stress can lead to short-term physiologic and psychological adjustments that are necessary for immediate survival and adaptation, but which make them a significant cost to long-term outcomes in learning, behavior, health, and longevity. In other words, the way we adapt to early environment helps us survive early environment, but then it exacts a cost later on. So this woman adapted to her environment by suppressing herself so as not to make trouble, so as she'd be more accepted. Basically, it's her substitute for being loved. The trouble is that when we adapt those coping mechanisms early in life, we can't let go of them. Because we're not even aware. We think that's us. And the analogy is something like this. Imagine that you are on the North Pole in freezing cold or below freezing cold, and you put on a heavy fur coat which will save your life. But then imagine that you're transported to the equator still wearing that coat. That coat will not kill you. Help you survive in one environment, kill you in another. It's the same with these early coping patterns that we adopt. And so that virtually all problems that we face later on in life are as a result of these early adaptive patterns that we had to willy-nilly adapt, and we didn't even adapt them consciously or knowingly, which makes it all the more difficult to let go of them. But we're still stuck in them. So as one particular writer says, it's a question of redeeming our life from our history. Redeeming our life from our history, because our history becomes our life until we consciously realize that no, we may have a choice in the matter. The child has no choice in the matter. Now what happens when we look at Lou Gehrig's life? Lou Gehrig's father was an alcoholic. Now, those of you that may have grown up in homes where there's alcoholism, what happens in a child-parent relationship in such homes? Anybody can, sorry? But how does the child adapt? The child becomes the parent. That's called the parentification of the child. It's a role reversal. And that role reversal invariably results in pathology for the child later on. But that's how they survive. And so Gehrig's father was an alcoholic, and Gehrig became the caretaker to her mother, and that meant, to his mother, and that meant never, ever saying no, and always being quote-unquote responsible. And that's why he never missed a game. It's no great achievement not to miss a game when you got a flu. The achievement is to stay home. In Canada, there's a very famous example of this. He's a national hero. Some of you may have heard of him in the U.S., although we tend to hear a lot more about you guys than you hear about us, the general. His name is Terry Fox. And Terry Fox was a teenager who had developed bone cancer in his leg, and his leg had to be amputated below the knee. And Terry then decides, I think 17 or 18, I'm not sure how old he was, Terry then decides to, maybe a bit older, to run across the country, to jog across the country with his prosthesis as a way of raising awareness of cancer. Halfway across his trip, and there's this iconic image of this young guy with curly hair, determined expression on his face, running along the Canadian highway with this metal leg. And of course it became a national cause. And then, about halfway through his journey, turned out the cancer had come back. Now Terry is a Canadian icon, and he's like a saint, and certainly an admirable person for his courage, determination. But is he an example to follow? Does anybody actually believe that the return of his cancer was unrelated to the stress he put himself under? And I don't know what his early years were like, but I'm pretty sure I could tell. So we're looking at adaptations here. And in the book I give an example of myself doing this. Like this is very general. We all do this to one degree or another. So in this example, I'm visiting my mother in a nursing home. My mother had muscular dystrophy, a genetic disease that runs in our family. And so she was unable to move by the end of her life. She was mentally very with it, emotionally strong, physically disabled. So I'm visiting her, and that afternoon, as I walked down the hall in the nursing home, I have a bit of a limp. And I have a limp because that morning I had had arthroscopic surgery to remove a torn cartilage from my knee, which I incurred by jogging on cement. And it used to hurt, but as a physician, I never learned the possible connection between pain and tissue damage. And so I continued to jog on cement until I did the surgery. So that afternoon, I have a bit of a limp. Except when I walk into my mother's room, the limp completely disappears. And I walk into the room with a perfectly nonchalant gait, greet her, we have a visit, I walk out, shut the door, and start limping again. Well, what was I doing? What was I doing? Protecting my mother from worrying about my pain. Now, here's the deal. My mother was 78 at the time, I was 54. My mother had survived the genocide of the Second World War, the death of her parents in Auschwitz. She survived the communist dictatorship in Hungary, the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, emigration to Canada when she was 38 with 2 adolescent boys, the birth of a new child in a new country when she was nearly 40, learning a new language, making her a new home in a really different culture, and all that. The death of my father subsequently. Do you think she needed to be protected from the fact that her middle-aged son had a bit of a limp the afternoon of arthroscopic knee surgery? You know? So what was I doing? Well, I'll tell you what I was doing. What's that? I did it, but the question is why? Why did I do that? And she did not need that. She did not need me to put her first. What's that? It's an adaptation, absolutely. And here's the deal. If you read my books, you'll notice that I was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1944 to Jewish parents. And this is 2 months before the Germans occupy Hungary. So 2 months before the genocide descends upon the Jews of my country. So I'm 2 months old at the time, and the Wehrmacht, the German army, marches into Budapest. And the next day my mother calls the pediatrician and says, "Would you please come and see Gabor, because he's crying all the time." And the pediatrician says, "Of course I will come, but I should tell you, all my Jewish babies are crying." So Almas, A.H. Almas, the California-based spiritual teacher, I think was speaking here this weekend, he says in one of his books, the child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of its own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother or of anyone else he's with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. So here's what happens. And this is really the core of what I'll tell you the whole day. The child has two needs. The child has an absolute need for attachment. Attachment being loved. I know we talk about attachment in the Buddhist sense, but that's not what I'm talking about right now. Right now I'm talking about the attachment relationship, that dynamic that draws us close to other people. And without that dynamic, and without our brains being wired for attachment, we would not survive, because simply we're so helpless and utterly dependent as infants. So without somebody taking care of us, and us being cute enough that they will want to, which is why as babies we pretend to be so cute, you know.
All right, so that starts that one. Kind of a landscape start with some broad brush strokes and some sort of swiveling brush patterns to lay out the background hills, which I think is kind of nice. It's sort of going to be a serene setting. So that's it for the moment. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting, angels, and umbrellas. Have a good night, Earth.